Hi, my name is Andy Park, and I've been a working artist for the past 25 years. For the first 10 years of my career, I worked as a comic book artist, and for the next 5 years, I worked in video games as a concept artist, and for the past 10 years, I've been helping to design the characters and helping to come up with the visual look of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. In this tutorial, I'm going to go over how I approach painting a head, doing a likeness. In particular, I'm going to be doing a 3-part series on painting Thor, played by Chris Hemsworth, and in part 2, painting Loki, played by Tom Hiddleston, and comparing and contrasting their visual looks, my approaches to painting, and in part 3, we'll have a little fun with both characters as a bonus video, and hopefully you can get something out of it. So let's dive right in. So normally when I start a painting, I like to get rid of the white. The first thing I do is to tone it a little bit on the gray side. I give it a little bit of warmth, so it's not just this completely muted gray color. So I set my brush a little warmer and a little darker, maybe almost a 50% gray, but a little warmer, and I start doing circles. And of course, it's always easier to draw smaller, so I'll take that, enlarge it, and this is the basis for the head. You cut off the sides a little bit, and then you add the lower part, which is the jaw, and eventually you'll cut off those sides, and that'll be your basic head shape. From here, you cut the circle in half, and that middle line of the circle is the brow line. Then you take the top and the bottom, and the half point of those will be the eyes, half of that is the nose, and half of that is the lower mouth. So you start off with the brows, and then you bring in the nose. The bottom of the nose hits that middle point, add in the eyes, and the bottom part of the lips will hit that part, generally speaking. Of course, every face is different. It depends on the person. The ears go from the brow to the bottom of the nose, and then you get rid of the rest of the circle. And generally speaking, there's an eye in between each of those points, sides and the middle. And then adding some details, adding the neck, the shoulders, and general hairline, and then kind of just, having a little fun here and turning this to a generic person into someone familiar. Not a complete likeness, but drawing me, kind of, sort of. So certain features, skinnier neck, eyes, mouth, and my shirt. So generally speaking, that's how it goes. When it comes to any drawing or painting, you always want to start off with the basics. Break it down to the essentials. What is the shape of Thor? What is the shape of Loki? Thor, generally speaking, is very square, box-like, or rectangle. Loki has more of a triangular shape. So if you take that basic shape and then you nuance it a little bit, and this is basically just caricature. I'm trying to wrap my head around these two looks, and Thor having a very boxy shape, Loki having more sharp angles, a pointier chin. Thor has that very classic, ultimate, handsome male look, superhero. He is a superhero come to life, and Loki has, little different features. Everything's kind of inset into the center of his face. He's got a larger forehead, pointier chin. And Thor has all those classic elements that you think of when it comes to a superhero: thick neck, square jaw. So that's the basics of these characters. Comparing and contrasting always helps you to see better than just seeing something in isolation. So I'll create a new layer, and I'm using the chalk brush, the one that comes with Photoshop, and I like using that because it emulates when I used charcoal, like back in my school days, art school days, and doing figure drawing, figure painting. I would do a charcoal, and basically it's a lay-in. I'm not trying to get detail. I'm trying to rough in all the landmarks, the general placement of things, of features, and I'm thinking big picture. You're gonna see that in this painting, I pretty much stay at this view. I rarely zoom in, because I'm always reminding myself that I need to just focus on the big picture rather than trying to go in and do details, which is always very tempting, especially with digital mediums. But generally speaking, I stay far back, and I used to do that back in the day when I painted. You would like stand back away from your painting, but here I'm just laying in all the features. I'm going to be doing Thor Ragnarok. Thor is a Thor that I got to design, and a film that I got to lead the visual development team at Marvel Studios. And when I'm doing head paintings, I like to get to color as soon as possible. I don't like doing full clean line art, line drawings. I like the painterly process more. There's no exact right way to go about it, and there might be times when I will spend more time doing lines, but generally speaking, this is kind of like how I like to approach things. Painting underneath the layer of the drawing so that I can I won't lose the drawing, but I can put in colors, and you're gonna see that I'm color picking and choosing different colors. In the lower right, you'll see I like using the HSB, which stands for hue, saturation, brightness, because that's generally the same thinking that you have when you're doing traditional painting. You're thinking about the hue, which is the color, the saturation, like how saturated it is versus how desaturated you want to make that color, and then the brightness is the value, so going from light to dark. So it's all in there. And from here I went to the line drawing, the rough lay-in, and I just preserved transparency to make it a little darker and paint it in a little darker color so that I can see it. Then I add another layer, and I'm starting to add a little bit of the darks. And when I'm doing the darks, I want to keep it fairly saturated. It's easy to just, I think a mistake that young artists might make is they think shadows will just be dark, but they're not really thinking about the hue or how saturated it is. So it's a good idea to, especially in certain areas, to keep shadows fairly saturated. You don't want shadows to just become devoid of color. So especially around certain areas like where there's a lot of blood vessels, like the eyes, the lips, the nose. But also, as I'm putting in laying in these shadows, generally, I know that later on I'm going to be going even darker. So it's okay to kind of go extreme with colors as you're laying in these beginning colors. And I like working painterly rather than going too tight or being too careful. So of course this video is sped up about 3 times, so it's not sped up a crazy amount, but I like working around the head rather than sticking to one area. I don't like just sticking to I'm gonna render out this eyeball. I like moving around because like everything I've been saying in this tutorial, you want to keep thinking about the overall. You always want to have that perspective that you're thinking about the overall rather than falling into the trap of focusing on detail. As you get more and more rendering going on, you can start, it's a cake theory where you start off big, the base, the foundation, and then as you start building the cake that is the painting, you can start adding more and more detail, and eventually the frosting and those minute details. But the most important thing is to think of the overall, the big picture, and that's why it's good to move around the painting so your eyes are constantly moving rather than getting fixated on just one location. Because you get fixated in one location, you lose sight of what's going on. And there's another thing that I do a lot that you'll see is flipping the canvas, because a lot of times we all get blind to what we're seeing and proportions start getting off. We don't realize it until you flip it. It's something I used to do during my comic book days when I drew with a pencil and actually on paper, on a Bristol board. I would hold it up to the light above me or on a light table so that I can see the reverse image, or I have a mirror next to me and hold it up to the mirror so that I can see, oh wow, one eye is above the other, or you see what's wrong. Here you can see me constantly adding different colors. I'm moving the color picker around, or sorry, not the color picker, but picking different colors. And as you add more and more colors into the painting, eventually, it's easy. It's good because you're putting on little nuances, little changes in value, tone, hue, and you can color pick as well as you're painting. So here I'm adding I'm adding darks to the nose and little nuances, little details. So now we're getting to like some more little details, little nuances, constantly going back and forth, brightening up in areas, and I'm playing with the hue as well. It's not just a matter of staying in one hue and going up and down the values and saturation. Generally speaking, when it comes to the head, it's a subtle thing, but you're going to see a band. Like the forehead, the top of the head has a little bit more of a yellow tone, and then as you go towards the eyes and around the nose, middle band, it's more red, because a lot of the blood vessels around the nose and the eyes, there's a lot more rosiness. And then as you get to the lower part of the head, around the mouth and chin, it gets a little bit more bluer, or kind of desaturated. Another mistake that you'll see a lot of young artists will make was painting the eyes white, because that's generally what we think. But if you saw the color that I picked for the whites of the eye, it was I think about like a 30% value, going 30% dark value. So it was quite dark compared to like going to all the way to 100%. So I guess it was not a 30% white, it's more like a 70%, around there, 60-70%. I'm thinking top to bottom when I think of the percentages, so I'm a little backwards and mixed. But I'm continuing to detail out things that I see, little nuances. If you want to see the ref that I'm using, I'm not showing it here because I'm fairly new to YouTube and I'm not exactly sure on the rules, but I know there's a lot of copyright rules, so I didn't want to put the photo in this video and get some kind of strike or slap on the wrist. But it's easy to find. If you just Google Thor Ragnarok or Thor Gladiator Thor, you'll be able to find this ref. So if you want to have it on the side as you're watching this, it might be a good reference, so you can kind of see the details from the photo that I'm looking at as I'm eyeballing and seeing the nuances in color and shape and proportions. And painting is a series of looking, making decisions, thinking about color, value, saturation, moving around, playing with detail, knowing when to add detail, when to do bigger brush strokes. That's the other thing that you probably are seeing, is I will play with the brush size. When I want to go detail, I will of course shrink the brush, and I'm adding a layer whenever I feel it's necessary. Right here, I switched my brush to the basic circle brush. I squeeze it, I flatten it, and I just kind of angle it, and I made it softer, so a little bit more of an airbrushy feel, so that I can basically blend. It's acting like blend, because the chalk brush is pretty unforgiving. It gives very broad, bold, opaque strokes, but it doesn't really have like a soft quality to it, which is cool because it's very much like an oil painting. But in oil painting, as you know, you can also push and pull the paint, which the chalk brush doesn't do. So essentially, the circle brush, when you make make it soft, and you act like a airbrush, you can kind of pretend like you're blending. There are blending brushes as well, which sometimes I'll play with, but for this painting, I'm using just the chalk brush mainly, probably 90% of the times, or 95% of the times, and the circle brush occasionally when I want to do just some details. The circle brush squash, like what you're seeing right now, is very good. Wait, is this the circle brush? It's very good for when you get very minute, small details. Because when you squash the circle brush at that particular angle, you can get a very thin line. And then if you go stroke the other way, you know, it's like a chisel brush, or very much like a flat brush when you're doing traditional paintings. So if you want to get a thin line, you just turn your brush to that straight side, and then you can make a thicker brush stroke by just turning the brush angle. So I'm just continuing to add details, putting in the darks. Look at how saturated under the eyes I had the color, quite saturated. This is kind of a mid-saturation level for under the eyes. Again, because of the blood vessels, always going back and forth, color picking. In the nose, a lot of times it's, you know, very dark, and that gets actually really saturated, even though a lot of times it might just look like black. It's not necessarily black. One thing that you'll notice, and something that I learned in school, as I'm in art school, when you're painting, you almost never want to use white. Like, white is rarely seen in real life. Like, I guess the closest would be like if you're looking at the sun, you know, at least the center part, the hottest part would be a white, and then right soon after that, you know, you'll start getting colors. But in real life, in the real world, you rarely see white. Like, it's always influenced by light, and it's always things that are, you can create the illusion of white, like in those eyes, because it's relative to all the values and colors around it. But, you know, if I were to color pick that eyeball, it would be about a 70, maybe 60-70% white. Look at how light those blues are, and look at how dark it is in the color picker, in the HSB right there. And you'll notice on the left eye, at the very top, it's a subtle thing, but in the photo I noticed, oh wow, it's like there's a shadow right there. So it's tricky, because part of it, the white part of his eyes are covered in shadow, which can come off looking weird, because that can look like his eyelid. But I was trying to be careful to like show that that's actually a shadow that you see at the top part of you can see right there. And this is probably one of the few times where I'll zoom in, because I'm doing the eyeball, but as you can see, I didn't stay there very long. So I just, when it's necessary, you know, definitely will zoom in. And a lot of times it depends on the level of finish. So in my job at Marvel Studios, a lot of times I have to do marketing illustrations, you know, and these are illustrations that are going to be that are going to have to get approved by the actor, and it's going to have to, the purpose of those paintings is to promote and sell the film. So I need to get the likeness like 100% spot on, and the detail has to be there, because they're going to be on posters and that kind of thing, or toy boxes, or whatever they're going to be used for. So those, you know, I'll spend more time, and I'll take the time to try to get as photoreal as I can. You know, there's always an element of keeping it painterly, which is nice, but yeah, for those, you know, then once I get the general likeness, you know, then a lot of time will be spent like zooming in just to make sure every detail is there. But for the most part, for my concept art paintings, like, you know, doing a painting to this level, you know, which is still, you know, you're going for a photo real look, but obviously it's a painting. That's the kind of look that I prefer to do. And a lot of times for my concept art, I have to do paintings of heads and likenesses of the actor, whether it be Chris Hemsworth as Thor, or Brie Larson as Captain Marvel, or Paul Rudd as Scott Lang. Like, you know, we're always going to be trying to get that likeness, because my job is to help sell that the costumes that we're designing, the helmets, the character that we're designing, to the director, for the directors to be able to approve, and the producers to say, yeah, that's what I want that character to look like in my film, in their film. So here Okay, so now I'm liquefying. So a lot of times after I have a certain amount of painting done, I know that things are off, because I'm generally speaking, it's there, but I know it doesn't completely look like him. So that's why at this point I flip the canvas, because at this point I could see better because I've been looking at it the other orientation for so long. And now that I even rotated the reference photo, I can see how things are off. So now liquefy is great to be able to just like push and pull. I copied and pasted the whole image so that I still have all those layers before that I did, and then here I can just like move everything, move it around, the subtleties. I noticed the eyes needed to be pushed a little bit to the side, the face had to be pushed in, little nuances. So this is subtlety, but I'm studying the photo, the reference, and I'm pushing and pulling to try to get that likeness to match, noticing that the ears have to be higher because of the perspective, and then I'm making the brush bigger or smaller, because the bigger you make that brush, you can move bigger chunks of the painting, versus if I want to just nudge little areas, then I'll make that brush size smaller. But this is the power of Photoshop, to be able to, and I know Procreate does this as well, but the ability to be able to push and pull, something you can't do in traditional painting. So here, look at the difference, like back and forth. You can see like a big difference in just where things are. So here I flipped it to the original orientation, and then I noticed there was more differences. So here I noticed the overall interior of the face was too small for the head, so I decided to copy paste it and enlarge it ever so slightly, nudge it, and I think I'm making decisions. I'm making decisions and seeing how I turn the layer on and off to see, does that look better, does that look more like the reference? And I noticed the hair had to be pulled down some. I'll also use the transform warp tool to push the hairline down, and then I'll go back and forth a lot of times to just see what I did and making sure that it's an improvement more towards the reference. So here I'm doing the warp tool again, pushing his jaw a little bit to the left and down. It's all nuances, going back and forth. The other great thing about Photoshop, you can undo, right? Or history, you can always go back. So here I'm doing even more liquefy, because I'm constantly studying the reference, seeing what needs to be adjusted, and just keep on making those nuanced adjustments. So this tutorial might be a little different than a lot of tutorials you've seen, maybe, because this really is not only about head painting, but it's about trying to get that likeness, which is always a challenge, because generally speaking, I like to just like paint and not worry about likenesses, because then it's just, you don't have to do this step where I'm nudging and trying to find that likeness of that actor. But you're gonna find that it's a good skill to have. It's not something you have to have, but it's obviously a job like I have, when I'm designing for films and for characters that are played by real actors, then it's something good to have. Of course, you could always just throw in a photo, and that's, a lot of artists will do that, and that's totally fine, but it's totally up to you, the artist. That's something, just at the end of the day, my background, the way I'm wired, I love to paint heads. Back in the day when I drew comic books, that's always the favorite part, is to draw faces, draw heads. When I went to art school, I loved painting heads. In my job at Marvel Studios, I love painting heads. I love designing costumes and the full body and poses and all that stuff, but heads are always particularly fun to draw and paint. So it's something that a lot of us in the visual development department will take the time to actually paint these heads. but it's a personal choice. It's up to you. But yeah, it's really fun. It's really, at the end of the day, it's a decision I made because it's fun. I love painting heads. I love painting faces. It's the soul of the character. At the end of the day, the costumes, the character, what they look like overall is important, but it's the head that is the heart and soul of who that hero is, whether it be Captain Marvel or Ant-Man, Thor, Hela. So now I'm starting to feel fairly good with the head, so now I can start adding other details from just certain details from his costume. Those discs, been using the chalk brush again, and just laying in. This whole process that you're seeing is very, very similar to what you would do if you're painting traditionally, whether it be acrylic, whether it be markers or oil paint. It's not that different. The difference is you can make a lot more mistakes doing it digitally and not have repercussions. With traditional painting, you have to plan, you have to make sure that your process is correct, because with oil painting, it's one of those, you could always let it dry and paint over it, but when you mix and mix, things can get muddy really fast. But digital, the same thing applies with acrylic and watercolor. But with digital, you don't have to worry about that. So the great thing about digital painting is you don't have to have fear. You can be fearless, and what I love to do, I have my I use the Wacom Intuos tablet, and I have my pen, the button on the pen to be the undo button. So I like to have it so the undo button goes back and forth. So basically it's undo once, and if I undo again, press the button again, it'll go back to what I did initially, instead of like constantly pressing the button and it goes back in history each step. I like to just do one step so that I can try something bold, and then if I don't like that brush stroke or whatever I did, whether it's a transform, whatever, I can just press that button on my pen and it'll like go back and forth, so I can make decisions. At this point, this is the icing, right? The part that a lot of people love and enjoy, but this is also a part that, because it's fun, you can go overboard, and you're gonna see, I'm gonna backtrack a little bit, but here I'm starting to add the highlights. So again, looking at the reference photo, and then moving down the face, and as I'm going down, you'll see I'll find other things, and I'll color pick certain areas from the dark parts of the nose or the cheek, and I'll adjust right there. That line was too strong of a line. I'm going to knock it back, and then I'll color pick a light part again, the highlight, and I'll continue painting. Right there I color picked, and constantly correcting. Nothing is set in stone, and you got to take advantage of the medium that you have. And if you're doing digital, you should never be beholden to what you have, and should never fall in love. Here I desaturated the highlight because this part of the highlight is different than the light that you see in the front of the face. So a lot of times the side of is more of a reflective light. So a lot of times that will be like the sky, versus the front of the face might be some direct lighting that's coming in front of him. You'll see right here, I'm going to be painting saturated dark shadow, and then on the side I grade it out, so less saturated, a little lighter, but that's also a reflective light, probably from the sky. And then in the hair, you might see a little bit in there as well. So and then a lot of times where that's a cast shadow under this chin, but right as it transitions from shadow to the light of his neck, will be a very saturated color. That happens a lot of times, as well as form shadows where it rolls from light to dark. That transition a lot of times will be a saturated color, something to keep in mind. So adding little details in the armor, little highlights and little form details, little shadows. And we're getting closer. You know, this is starting to look pretty good overall. A lot of times I'll turn off and on the layer to try to see the progress. A lot of times I do that as a psychological thing to kind of show myself, you know, how much I've progressed, and then it helps me to stay excited and to keep at it. And here what I did was I added another layer and combined it as a clipping mask, and then I changed the layer property to overlay, and I have a pretty dark gray purple, and I started like adding colors to the background, and now I'm even integrating that layer on top of everything in subtle areas, a little bit in the nose, under the eyes. I'm trying it out to see, but adding an overall kind of layer of purple. And the point of adding the purple overall is to kind of help unify this painting, you know, to add an overall color to something. And it's just something you might do in traditional as well, where it's like a very thin glaze in certain choice areas. Nothing you want to do like this too aggressively, but it's subtlety. And now I'm painting opaquely again, little details that I see from adding the highlights, little lights under the lip and around the corners of the mouth, and then turning that on to see how it all unifies. And then here I'll do an overall layer. This is where I'm adjusting the overall levels, playing with the highlights and the shadows, crunching them and turning on and off to see the difference. Normally that's something you get kind of blind to as well. Adjusting the colors as well, the highlights, you can control the highlights and the shadows. Here I'm adjusting the highlights to be a little cooler, seeing that effect, turning it on and off and seeing the differences, and seeing, I kind of like that. That's kind of cool. And then here you're gonna notice that I adjusted the highlights, but the highlights were just too bold, as you can see. So I'm starting to knock down. At this stage, I want to knock down the highlights and have it be stronger on top and a little subtler. So I added a mask over the highlight layer, and I'm starting to paint into the layer masks and bringing them back. So as you can see me turning it on and off to see what it looks like without the layer mask right there. And then I'll paint in some into the layer mask and bringing it back. So because I think the way I did the highlights was too aggressive, so bringing a little bit of subtlety, I think brings a little bit more realism. And then over on top I'll add an overlay layer, and just, you know, I'll add certain values to just kind of like punch and pull to bring some stuff out, push some stuff back. Here I realize, you know, I'm looking at the reference and I'm adjusting, realizing that his hair, some of the side of his face needs to be pulled in, even more so, bringing that down ever so slightly, pulling that side of his nose, his side of his neck a little bit in because it was a little bit pushed out too much, making adjustments even at the end to make it look more accurate to the reference, adding subtle lights because it looked a little flat in his eye area, so wanting to have a little bit of that roundness to be able to see the sphere of the eyeball. So bringing little shadows right there on that side, right in there, because the light is coming from the right of the picture, so it should get a little darker there, and the highlight should be on the right side. So I think it's looking pretty good. Just last minute little details realizing that's a little too dark right there in the lip. And also I noticed in this photo that his mouth is like slightly open, so I'm trying to capture that as well. And this background was bugging me a little bit, the shape, so I'm just readjusting using a layer mask on that background layer and trying to come up with a shape that just a little bit more pleasing, or at least something that I like. I like that better. Well, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. This was part 1 of a 3-part series on how to paint Marvel gods. So if you like this video, please subscribe, like, share, and hit the notification button so you'll know when I drop the part 2 video. And please leave a comment. I'd love to hear what you think. And until next time, take care.